There are few things in the world that irritate me more than hearing someone say, "Why didn't you just leave?" to a survivor of abuse. Now, this question is not nearly as easily answered as you may think it is. And the reason why is because abuse actually changes your brain. It not only changes your brain, but it can straight up damage it. And while I am all about healing and recovery and moving forward, there is a reality that so many survivors face due to this stigma. The reason that this is so flipping important is because once we recognize and understand what happens in a survivor's brain, we can then begin to understand why they do what they do, why they struggle to leave, and we can then work on healing from the inside out. And maybe, just maybe, with enough knowledge and enough education, we can stop asking, "Why didn't you leave?" and start asking, "Wow, why did they abuse?" As I go through this video, I'm going to be sharing some excerpts from different articles. All sources used in today's video will be in the show description. So make sure you go and check that out and dive deeper. I highly encourage you to do so. So the first thing is to recognize that abuse actually impacts and changes the brain. Once you have this understanding, you can begin to recognize that what the survivor is going to do is not going to be logical. Why? Because their brain has been changed and what they're going through is not logical. When you go through an abusive relationship, things don't make logical sense. And after doing some digging, I found that there's an actual biological reason why. The following excerpt comes from psychologytoday.com. Several important ingredients that contribute to someone's addiction to their abuser are oxytocin for bonding, endogenous opioids for pleasure, pain, withdrawal, and dependence, corticotropin releasing factor, withdrawal and stress, and dopamine, which increases craving, seeking, and wanting. With such strong neurochemistry in dysregulated states, it will be extremely difficult to manage emotions or make logical decisions. Wait a minute, hold up. Let's go read that one more time. With such strong neurochemistry in dysregulated states, it will be extremely difficult to manage emotions or make logical decisions. Your brain is producing chemicals all the time based off of your experiences and based on what's going on around you. But the tumultuous effect of the abusive relationship is causing an overdumping of so many of these addictive chemicals within the brain. This means that even when things are unhealthy, your brain is going to naturally gravitate towards staying with them because it just wants the pleasure of all of those chemicals being dumped on the brain. Let's get back to the article. What happens neurobiologically in a toxic union is not much different from what happens in a normal relationship. The main difference is that given that our brain is extremely responsive to what is happening in our environment, it releases chemicals in reaction to the toxic partner's behavior. If he or she pulls away or behaves poorly, there is a reaction that someone in a normal relationship would not experience. This is also true of neurochemistry such as endogenous opioids, dopamine, and corticotropin releasing factor. This was something that actually blew my mind. I assumed that between the abusive relationship and a quote unquote normal relationship, I assumed that the chemical dumps within the brain would actually be different. Finding out that the chemicals are actually the same chemicals dumped in a healthy relationship versus an unhealthy relationship really proved to me the power of dosage within this case. The problem in an unhealthy relationship is that there is an unhealthy amount of these chemicals being dumped on the brain, followed by the crash of the partner pulling away and or being abusive. This brings a lot of confusion to the brain and it goes, "Oh my gosh, I want that chemical dump, but why did it hurt so bad? But I don't even care. I want that dump again and I just need that." This is so important. Normal partners do not create the same emotionally charged climate as an abuser. So once again, even though the chemicals are the same, it's the emotional charge behind them and the amount of chemicals that are being dumped in the brain due to the toxic nature of the relationship. Context is everything when it comes to the brain. When our brains attempt to make sense out of conflicting information, i.e., the abuse coming from someone that we love, a process of reasoning and rationalization is common. But real quick, before I dive into the next part of the excerpt, it's important to recognize what cognitive dissonance is. Cognitive dissonance is basically two conflicting emotions. It's the one side of the brain going, "This is someone that I love and I care about, and they're also abusive." Your brain is trying to reconcile these two differences and trying to make them make sense, i.e. going, "Well, okay, I love them and they're abusive. Maybe it's that abuse equals love, or maybe this is just what love is." is. Maybe I'm being oversensitive. Keeping this in mind is going to help you understand the next part of the article. Resolving cognitive dissonance is a form of self-regulation and self-calming enacted by the brain. The victim's rationalization of their dysfunctional, possibly dangerous situation reflects a form of cognitive reappraisal. So once again, this means that the brain is trying to rationalize what's happening to keep itself out of a stressed state. When it's in a stressed state, it can't think logically, and your brain desperately wants to stay in a calm state so it can begin to keep you safe. What it doesn't realize is this is actually doing you more harm than good. This leads us to actually becoming addicted to the abuser. Just like we can become addicted to substances, our brain becomes addicted to the chemical dump that is caused by the abuser. This leads to an addiction to the abuser because your brain has now associated that chemical dump with that person. In the presence of such an addiction, there will be intense craving, a heightened value attributed to the abuser, and a hyper focus on the relationship and conflict resolution. The victim's thoughts will often follow to make sense of these feelings. Her or his brain usually turns to self-deception and rationalizations to resolve the cognitive dissonance. Let's just go back, rewind for just a sec. Her or his brain usually turns to self-deception and rationalizations to resolve the cognitive dissonance. The brain is literally deceiving itself because it just wants to figure out what the heck the answer to the problem is. And if the answer doesn't make logical sense, it's going to say and do things to make it make logical sense. So this explains why us victims don't leave their abusers, or when they do leave, they go back, or when they do go to court, they fight to make sure that they don't actually get in trouble for their actions. Because again, the brain is not being honest with itself, and the victim doesn't always see how much of a victim they really are. All right, so just a reminder, that excerpt was from psychologytoday.com. This following excerpt is going to be coming from STW News Press. Domestic violence impacts the brain and behavior. It causes trauma for the victim, and she or he may experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including hyperarousal, re-experiencing, avoidance, and numbing. This explains why we cannot just get over it as survivors. Because when you have gone through an abusive relationship, when you have experienced domestic violence, what happens is that your brain is literally just holding on by a thread. Even when you're no longer in the relationship, you can be run by the relationship for a long time, if not for the rest of your life. There are certain things that someone can say or do, certain ways that you're touched, certain things that come up and are going to continue to haunt you. And by the way, if to the survivor watching this, if you're someone who wants to share your story, but people are telling you to just get over it already, sharing your story is going to be part of how you heal. Don't hesitate to share your story. In fact, I've got a video right here where I tell you exactly why you should share your story and why you're allowed to. Something else that's a big struggle for survivors is the fact that they can't always verbally put together what happened to them right away, or even for some time after. This especially presents a problem when a victim of assault is going to get help and they are immediately questioned on the details of what happened. They may not be able to come up with direct answers, and they may end up being triggered. This leads people, especially law enforcement, to think that they're just making it up or that things weren't that bad. Because if it really was that bad, they would be able to talk about it. But that's not true. As Dr. Bessel van der Kolk states, traumatized people often have enormous difficulty telling other people what has happened. Their bodies experience terror, rage, and helplessness, as well as impulse to fight or flee. But these feelings are impossible to articulate. Therefore, traumatized people tend to respond differently, thereby causing others to assume that they weren't truly victimized. This is why having a basic understanding of the brain and why it does what it does and how it works is important for anybody and everybody who is dealing with people. Whether you are the leader of an organization, whether you are in law enforcement, whether you are in the medical field, whether you are a scientist, whether you are working at your local fast food place, recognizing why the brain does what it does and why it does it is going to be critical in helping a survivor actually get the help that they need. And this inability to communicate what happened doesn't necessarily pass right away, or even with a little bit of time. Once a person has been traumatized, it may become extremely challenging to truly express the full impact this incident has had on their life. They become fearful of reliving the experience. As Dr. van der Kolk states, traumatized people are often afraid of feeling. Their own sensations become the enemy. Even though the trauma is a thing of the past, the emotional brain keeps generating sensations that make the sufferer feel scared and helpless. This means means that a survivor can truly begin to fear their own sense of feeling. This was me personally. So anybody else who relates to this, you are not alone. The reason that this happens is because your trauma is held within your body, and your brain doesn't necessarily know the difference between what's actually happening and a memory of what's happening. And when you have these memories, when you have these flashbacks, your brain brings back the memory of those sensations, which means that not only are you just having a nightmare within your mental state, but this impacts your physical state because you can feel what happened to you consistently over and over again. Just because something happened a year ago doesn't mean that you've healed from it. I absolutely hate the phrase time heals all wounds because it doesn't. Whether you were out for a year or you've been out for 10 years, you can be in the same spot in your healing journey. Why? Because if you have not done the focused work, if you have not sought out the help that you need in order to heal, you're not going to necessarily grow and go anywhere because your brain is going to be stuck in survival mode. The really powerful and important thing to remember within an abusive relationship is to recognize that domestic violence is not about anger. It's about power and control. Why does this matter? When you recognize that there is a power and control dynamic within a relationship, you can then begin to understand why the victim is a victim and why the abuser is the abuser. When someone wants power, they do whatever it is that they need to do in order to maintain that sense of power and maintain that sense of control over the other person. The victim is now subjected to the person over them, which means they look to them for what to do and how to do it. Again, this is why so many people get stuck in these abusive relationships and they're not able to get out. Because again, it's not about anger. It's about being stuck in that power and control dynamic. It is one person's use of abusive tactics to gain power and control over another. According to researcher Lundy Bancroft, whether because of the abuser's manipulativeness, his popularity, or simply the mind-bending contrast between his professions of love and his vicious psychological or physical assaults, every abused woman finds herself fighting to make sense out of what is happening. The abusive person thrives on utilizing such techniques to intimidate and confuse the victim. Y'all, there is so much that goes into the psychology behind abusive relationships. This is why it is so flipping important. Can you imagine now knowing what you know about the brain, approaching a survivor and saying, well, why didn't you just leave? It wasn't that hard. Why didn't you go to law enforcement? Why didn't you ask for help? I really hope that this is beginning to shed some light onto why survivors don't always come forward and why this is such a pervasive problem to begin with. I also wanted to share with you some short-term and long-term effects of abuse. And one of the really important things that I want to make sure I bring to light here is that non-physical abuse is abuse. Period. End of story. Whether you agree with that or not doesn't change the fact that it is fact. Just because someone does not put their hands on you does not mean they're not abusive. As you're beginning to learn about the brain and how the brain can be impacted, we have not actually gotten into the effects of physical abuse on a person. This was just an overall umbrella. This is really important to recognize because a lot of people don't take abuse seriously until it becomes physical. But one, there are a lot of non-physical signs to build up that sense of power and control before we even get to the physically abusive part. But it's also important to recognize that just because a relationship does not escalate into abuse does not mean that you don't deserve help and does not mean that the victim is not a victim. The following excerpt from Medical News Today shares a bit about the short-term and long-term effects of abuse. Short-term. Emotional abuse can be difficult for the person on the receiving end to accept. At first, they may be in denial that the person they're in a relationship with is engaging in emotionally abusive behavior. For example, they may start to feel shame, hopelessness, fear, or confusion. These are just the emotional effects. As you begin to pass through those, you then find the physiological effects: moodiness and aches and pains, difficulty concentrating, and muscle tension. The longer the emotional abuse continues, the more prolonged these effects can become. These are just the short-term effects of what can happen when you're in an abusive relationship. This is important in recognizing, again, why survivors do what they do and how we can best support them. The crazy thing is that the longer things go, the worse things get, and things can actually begin to develop into chronic health conditions. Emotional abuse, like physical abuse, can have long-term effects on the brain and body. In fact, according to one study, severe emotional abuse can be as damaging as physical abuse and contribute to depression and low self-esteem. This study also suggested that emotional abuse may contribute to the development of chronic conditions such as fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. In addition to those, the victim may experience insomnia, chronic pain, social withdrawal or loneliness, guilt, anxiety, and eventually believing that what their partner says is correct and that they are in fact crazy, no good, and worthless. This is a lot of information that I threw at you today, but I really believe that it is so powerful and so important to recognize these things in order for us to better help survivors. From the survivor perspective, I found this information extremely liberating because I began to understand why I did what I did. And it was so much easier to begin this self-forgiveness journey for going through what I did. To the survivors out there, I hope that this gave you some peace to understand why you do what you do and how you can begin to heal. To the non-survivors, I hope that this sheds some light onto a not talked about enough subject that is buried in stigma. What would be really, really helpful is if you could please share this video. This information is extremely important, especially for those leaders just about in any organization, considering that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men are victims of abuse. Although I would like to say that since those numbers are highly underreported, I believe it is closer to 1 in 2 and 1 in 3, respectively. Knowing this can help us begin to process and understand how to help survivors, how to be there for them, and how to help them find freedom and truly experience the love that they deserve. Make sure that you check out this video right here because it's going to help you continue on your journey to begin to understand why survivors do what they do and how we begin to heal. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and never forget that you are strong. You are capable, you are intelligent, and boo, you are so freaking worthy.